Hi everybody, my name is Claire and I'm a Green Schools Biodiversity Officer. In this video we're going to learn a little bit about native woodlands here in Ireland. So we'll start by learning a little bit about um, trees in Ireland, what kinds we have and where we can find them. And then we will look at how you can identify a tree. So if there's a tree you're not familiar with and you go up to it, how can you work out what it is? Um, then we'll look at the difference between a native and a non-native tree or an introduced tree before we head into a woodland and see what it's like once you step inside. After that, we'll learn a bit about how trees can actually communicate with or even help each other. And lastly, we'll see what benefits do trees provide to the environment and to us as humans. So in Ireland, we have about 11% of the country covered in trees. And this is actually much lower than the average for countries in Europe, which is about 30 to 33%. So we do have fewer trees growing than many of our European neighbours. And the trees that we do have, you might find growing in a variety of ways. There can be trees planted or growing by themselves. You might find them growing in a hedgerow or together in a forest or a woodland. And there is a variety of different types of trees, and we can split them into different types of groups. So you might put trees in the deciduous or evergreen categories. So a deciduous tree is one which loses its leaves in late autumn, winter, whereas an evergreen keeps its leaves all year round. Or you can also split trees up into native and non-native, which we mentioned earlier. So a native tree is one which has been growing in Ireland since the last ice age, over 10,000 years ago, whereas a non-native or an introduced tree is one which was brought in by people more recently than that. So when it comes to identifying trees, there are many different things you can look at to help you, and it does depend partly on what time of year it is. So in spring and summer, most trees will have leaves that you can try looking at. And it's the trees, the color of its leaves, the texture, the shape, the size are all helpful clues. In later summer and autumn, many trees will have seeds or fruits, which can be a good thing to try and spot. Or in winter, you might be relying on things like the bark, the type of twigs, where the buds are to help you. And there's also the overall shape of the tree itself. Okay, so now let's look at a few examples, and we'll start off with some native trees.
Okay, so let's start off by looking at the alder tree, which is one of Ireland's tallest growing trees. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different ways of identifying a tree, from its seeds and fruits to its leaves to the canopy shape. And at the moment it's August, which is a good time for trying to identify trees. As you'll see as we go on, lots of these different features are available for us to check out. And starting off by having a look at the leaves, we can see that they're dark green. They're quite rounded with no point. You can also use your sense of touch to examine them. You might notice that the leaves of an alder tree are quite leathery. We can also see these green cone-shaped items on the tree, and these are the female flowers or catkins of an alder. And as we get further into winter, these will become more of a dark brown and they'll have a woody texture to them. And as they open up, it allows their seeds to be released. So we can see an example of them here. So they have kind of separated out a little bit here. And these are a good way to identify alder. Another tree you're probably all familiar with is the holly tree. And again, we're going to focus on its leaves. So holly has very distinctive dark green leaves. They're quite spiky, so you can clearly see the spikes here. And holly is an evergreen tree, so these leaves are present all year round. And sticking with the leaves, we're going to now check out an elder tree. And if it's a little bit later in the year, it would have some purple berries that would help us. But at the moment, we can look at its leaves. And one thing to notice about leaves is how they're growing from a stem. So for elder, leaves grow in pairs on either side of a stem, whereas other trees might just have an individual leaf on an individual stem. Now moving on to the silver birch tree, we're going to look at using a tree's bark as a way of identifying it. So birch trees have quite a distinctive white papery bark. This might be a familiar tree to you. They're often found in school grounds. And when you look at the bark quite closely, you'll see that sometimes it tends to start peeling off, and we never want to peel this off ourselves because you can damage the tree. And we can also identify it by looking at its leaves, which are shaped quite like arrows. So they're quite small and they go to a point at the end with a serrated edge around the sides. And then lastly, their branches are quite bendy. So this is another distinction. Most other tree branches would be harder than this. And now if we go on to have a look at an ash tree, this is a good example of how you can identify a tree in winter when it may not have leaves, and that's by looking at its buds. So ash trees have quite definitive black kind of soft velvety buds. It makes them look a bit like a pencil. So they're a good way to look at a tree in wintertime. And now a yew tree is completely different to the ones we've seen before. So it has more spikes or needles rather than leaves. They're quite soft to the touch, even though they look quite spiky. And they grow in 2 rows on either side of the stem. And now Scots pine tree. So this is a coniferous tree, another very tall tree that we have in Ireland. And you can see here its canopy is quite distinctive, but with this, as it's a young tree, we'll first look at its needles. So these are quite spiky and they grow in all directions from its stem. And we can see that there are some pine cones just starting to grow. They're still green, so these will change as winter comes. And these are some mature Scots pine trees. So you can see that their canopy is all at the top. They don't have branches growing along the bottom. And this is in contrast to an oak tree. So an oak tree is Ireland's national tree. It's one we probably all know quite well. And we can see that this again is an example of an older or a mature tree. And unlike the Scots pine, its canopy is quite spread out, so it has branches and leaves growing in all directions from the trunk, quite low down as well as high up, so it's quite spread out. And its leaves are quite tough and waxy when you feel them, and they have a wavy shape, so quite distinctive. And we can also see there have acorns beginning to grow. So those are just a few examples of native Irish trees. This is the full list, and some of them are more common than others, so you might be more familiar with trees like ash and oak, than other ones like the Guelder rose or the wych elm. So it just depends on where you are. So some of the non-native trees that we have been planted for use in forestry, like Sitka spruce, but we also have some other non-native trees or introduced trees, which you might find commonly growing in schools or parks or even gardens. And these can also have a lot of benefits to our wildlife, which we'll talk about later. So we'll just have a look at a couple of examples. So the first one is the beech tree, and this is a very, very common tree in Ireland, one that a lot of people might assume is native. And we can distinguish these at the moment in a few ways. So if I feel their leaves, they're quite waxy and shiny. They feel quite smooth, dark green. And again, this is another good example of looking at their fruit. So they have this shell that is covered in quite soft spikes, and when these are ready in autumn, they'll open up to reveal the beech nuts inside. And then lastly, we'll look at a walnut tree. So this is a bit less common than the beech tree, but one you might recognize. So their leaves are an oval shape which have a point at the bottom. And then we can see that this is the case for the walnut. So it's a smooth green, almost an egg shape growing. And inside of that, you'll find the walnut. So now let's look at what happens when trees grow together and make up a forest or a woodland. And let's see how that changes things. So at the moment, we're just at the entrance to a little woodland. And you can see that we have quite a lot of wildflowers, things like blackberries, brambles, and thistle. We can have some ragwort growing. Quite a lot of tall plants that are attracting a lot of bees and butterflies today. And let's just see how this changes as we go inside into the woods. Let's have a look. So as we walk in, first thing I notice is the temperature drops and we're in the shade. We have some younger trees at the entranceway. So this is a hawthorn. You can see it's quite young because it has quite a slender trunk. I can fit my hand around it. My fingers will touch. Which tells me it's very young. Also notice that as we go from the entrance where there's grass, as we go inside, the grass stops very quickly. The plant we do have growing along the floor is ivy. So you'll probably be familiar with ivy. It has like an arrow shaped leaf and it grows not just along the floor but also it will climb trees or even buildings. So you'll see, for example, on this hawthorn tree, the ivy is growing up and around the trunk. So they like to climb things, whatever they can find. And there are many other plants that you might find in the woodland, depending on which one you're in. And some are more important to know than others. Like this, for example, is called lords and ladies, and it's quite poisonous, so it's one to avoid. On the other hand, there are also edible plants sometimes to be found, like this wild garlic, which is a really tasty thing to forage for. And then, depending on the type of forest, you'll find many other types of flowers growing, as well as things like mosses and lichens, which you might find growing on the branches or fallen logs, as well as plants like this, which are ferns. And ferns are very commonly seen in forests. And what many of these plants have in common is that they are able to survive in areas outside of full sunlight. So when you're in a forest, you might notice that there's plenty of sunlight at the top of the trees, at the canopy, but for the trees, the shorter trees or the younger trees and the plants growing at the bottom, they have to be able to survive with less sun. Now, while you're walking in a woodland, what you are mostly seeing are what's above ground, but there is also a huge amount going on underneath the soil, just the roots of the trees. Usually those are hidden from view, but if you do happen to come across a tree that's fallen over and might have brought a large chunk of soil with it, you might have a chance to see its root system. Sometimes as well, there are certain types of trees which are more likely to have its surface roots exposed, like this yew tree, or if depending on the position of the tree, you might get a look at them as well. But there is much more below the surface that you're not getting to see too.
So the roots of a tree have many different functions. They hold the tree in place, so they move down beneath the soil and make an anchor for the tree. They also are responsible for taking water from the soil. So trees get all of their water from their roots, not through the leaves or anything above ground. And in addition to this, roots allow trees to communicate with each other. So when trees are living in a woodland where there's a large amount together, they're able to use something called the Wood Wide Web to share messages and even nutrients. So growing on the roots of trees are fungi, and these fungi can actually connect from the roots of one tree to the roots of another. And this allows for a system of sharing messages and sharing things like nutrients. So in some situations, you might have the tallest tree in the woodland getting much more sunlight than shorter trees. And because of this, this tree is able to make more of its own food through the process of photosynthesis because it's getting more light. And when it has leftover nutrients, these can sometimes be passed down through the roots, through the fungi, and into the tree next to it. So this is a big benefit to trees and woodlands because they are helping each other out.
So moving on to the benefits that trees provide us, there are so many to mention. One very important thing they do is they remove carbon dioxide from the air and store it as carbon. They also can support a lot of different types of plants and animals. And in addition to this, they can help prevent flooding and pollution of our waterways, as well as providing us with lots of the food, medicine, and different products like perhaps the table you're sitting at. So climate change, as most of you will know, is caused by greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, around our planet, which trap heat and cause Earth to heat up. But because trees actually absorb carbon dioxide, this helps to reduce the amount in the atmosphere. And trees do this as part of a process called photosynthesis, where they take carbon dioxide from the air and they store it as carbon, which helps them to grow. And as they do this, they also release oxygen. And the other thing we'll focus on is the amount of animals and plants that trees support. So trees are a very important place for animals to both live, find shelter, as well as finding things like food and water. So there's a huge amount of animals and plants which rely on trees in their habitat to support them. And the key here is having different types of trees in a habitat. So not all animals and plants will rely on the same type of tree to help them. They all need different things to survive. So there are some insects which want to feed on the nectar of trees. Others will rely on them for laying their eggs on their leaves and for camouflage. And we touched on it earlier, but there are plants and things like moss which also grow in trees, as well as fungus, which again we mentioned on the roots. We also tend to find different types of fungi growing on trees or on rotting logs. There's a huge amount of birds which will build their nests in trees, as well as feeding on the berries, seeds and nuts that they provide. So while it is possible to work out the exact number of species of trees capable of supporting, or exactly how much carbon dioxide they absorb over the course of their life, there are other things that are much harder to measure, like the enjoyment and relaxation we get from visiting a woodland, and also the value that trees and forests have, which have nothing to do with what they provide to us as humans, but just the value for themselves. And these things are just as important. So thank you very much for watching this video today. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure you spend some time going out and enjoying the trees, forests or woodlands in your area.